Good morning or good night. It depends where you are right now today. Well, my name is Tomás Bandy. I'm the program officer with CIPE. So today we are live from Bogotá, Colombia, for discussing about the influence of the corrosive capital in Latin America, lessons learned and experiences. So we have a great panel with great quality, with a lot of experience to discuss today the impact of the corrosive capital. And well, what is corrosive capital? It's a word that CIPE has developed for understanding basically the capital that comes from government origin, from authoritarian governments, from different places where we can say that they are dark, that they do not have any transparency that the capital needs to have in the societies and in the democratic and open societies that CIPE support and promote. For discussing about this corrosive capital subject, we have, as I told you before, with experts from Latin American countries, different experts. Well, the first one, the one who's going to be our moderator is Sergio, man from Colombia Risk Analysis, which is a consultancy firm, very successful in Colombia, and they're going to be helping in the moderation of the panel and also to understand better the process in Colombia. We also are honored to have two of our colleagues from CIPE or CIPE in Washington, D.C., Eric Hontz, who is the new director of the Center for Accountant Investment. Well, the word in English is accountable. Well, it's very difficult to be translated sometimes because, I mean, it's like about being responsible and responsibility, but it's also part of what we're going to be talking today, the difficulty of understanding much better the impact of the corrosive capital. Also, we have with us Catherine Tai, Deputy Regional Director for Asia. She's coming from Washington as well. And also we have Mauricio Alarcón, Executive Director, Citizenship and Development Foundation. Sophia Werner, Director of Operations and Finances of Foundation for Progress. So, I'm going to give the floor to Sergio for the moderation. Okay, well, thank you very much. And to Saibet, thank you very much. As I mentioned before, my name is Sergio Guzman, and the methodology of the panel of today is going to be the next one. So first of all, I would like everyone in every single country to talk for at least 5 minutes to open up this panel and conversation about what is your impression about the corrosive capital in your own countries. Then Eric and Catherine, they can actually give us an overview about what are the main risks and opportunities for corrosive capitals. And then I have prepared certain questions for guiding a conversation among us. And I would like you to, I mean, if you want to add something, this is a conversation, you know, this is not a rigid panel. So, well, we can start right now with Sophia Werner. So tell us. Okay, thank you very much, Sergio. My name is Sophia Wagner. I come in from Fundación para el Progreso. We are a think tank, especially focused to youngsters and in the diffusion or spreading of content. So we've been working with CIPE since 2020 in the project of the corrosive capital. In the first phase of the project, we had an analysis, description and exploratory analysis, analyzing the cash flow in Chile from no-democratic countries. And right now, we are in a second phase, which is all related with data collection. We are, I mean, seeing what type or sort of no-democratic enterprises are in Chile. So we have discovered that there are 52 big enterprises from no-democratic countries, mainly from China, 85%, from Arabic Emirates, and from Russia as well. But they are focused in some specific areas, in some specific industry like energy and telecommunications as well. In energy, the 25%. And in telecommunications, is 70%. And also we have enterprises focused in fishing, logistics, and in wines. So they are very relevant industries for Chile. Besides, we have found 50 agreements of nationals with municipalities and regional governments, mainly with the Chinese government, for establishing a cooperation in regards to education, culture. We have the biggest amount of Confucio institutes, 31 in Latin America. We have a lot of scholarships programs. We have received a lot of support and help in regards to the pandemic due to Chile was removed from the aid program at the OECD in 2017. So we are receiving a lot of help from some specific countries. When analyzing all this data, we have concluded that Chile has a state of right which is very strong, institutionality pretty well established, regulatory stability, and also we have a division and free expression, division of powers and free expression that has avoided that many of these capitals became corrosive capitals. But however, we found many risks especially in the public contracting sector, because there are possibilities for renegotiation. There are programs in the public purchases. Sometimes they are pretty dark. Our legal framework anti-corruption has got to be up to date. We need a beneficiary registry real in order to understand where the cash flow are coming and where the owners of the enterprises. We do not have any screening and investment screening. As I mentioned before, we've seen a concentration of investment in some industries like telecommunications and energy. Another important risk is the constitutional change that we are facing right now in Chile. This will change eventually a lot of our institutionality, the division of the powers, for example. So, well, there will be open a window for the security to change a little bit. Our recommendations in this sense are to up to date the corruption regulations, to create a real beneficiary registry, to foster the public debate about the same subject in order to facilitate the data access about foreign investment, to make the process much more transparent. Thank you, Sophia. Demian, I give you the floor. All right, thank you very much for being in here. Well, CIPE is a think tank that is 30 years old in Argentina, and it's been working for strengthening the democracy and the opportunities for people and persons in our country. So we've been working a couple of years ago in strengthening the investment and capital expenses. I mean, how the is invested in infrastructure in several modes. For example, the public budget that is attached from some fiscal restrictions, the multilateral organisms that they provide loans with some specific conditions, the public and private participation that has a very brief participation. It couldn't be taken into the practice, especially because of some macroeconomic reasons. And finally, the bilateral loans that we can call the corrosive capital for this conference. So this presentation, the idea is to talk widely. I would like to go deeply in some data and about some things that we found in some previous documents with the researchers that help us in working about this subject. But I would like to talk about the differential, like what are the what makes a corrosive capital, and basically are the conditions for these loans. Assessment of the project, for example, assessment of the environmental impact, and also the communitary impact. This is something that is present with the investment that is done with the government budget, the inter-American. There is a screening of investment about what the government is investing with their own resources. For the case of the multilateral loans, as we all know in this international context, every single loan is attached to some certain conditions for advance, for assessment, for the impact that they have about sanitation, that have to do with water for drinking and networks for vulnerable populations that require those conditions and mechanisms. But the bilateral, they do not report there is an important investment, but we do not know if it's yearly or we don't know what feasibility conditions they have. And with our recommendations, And with the evidence that we have displayed in this talk, we believe that it could be improved for those capitals to become constructive. They can build not only infrastructure but statal capacity installed at the same time to improve the regulatory environment in Argentina. And well, I'm going to close right here and eventually I will be talking. Thank you very much, Mauricio. Well, thank you very much, Sergio. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you for all those in the streaming. Well, in Ecuador, and yesterday I was talking about this, and we said that we are minutes to include the Mandarin language and to have some wheels in the Galapagos Islands and to push them in order to arrive to the real owners. So the country, it's been a lot of condition to China. Well, maybe to talk about some other corrosive capitals. Maybe does not even generate an interest in the country because the presence of China with conditioned loans for the construction execution, with multi-millionaire loans from the development bank, from the private Chinese bank, and also the foreign investments. Maybe it was unbelievable. We are talking about more than $16,000 million. For Ecuador, it represents 50% of the national budget. Conditioned credits for the construction execution, more than $23 billion in the loans for development bank and the private bank. And during some specific time period, more than $100 million per year. That for Ecuador, difference to other countries, well, it's a lot of money in foreign investment, really connected to the politics, because the presence of China in Ecuador was only, well, was minimum before Rafael Correa became president. He's a representative of the socialism of the 21st century. Well, to talk about corrosive capital in Ecuador is pretty difficult, not only because he's a brand newer, but also because we need to land it for the common citizen to understand it and to understand what's the impact about that money that is coming from an authoritarian, totalitarian regime with some imposed conditions may have in his or her own life. It's not about, maybe you can think, oh, well, there is a Chinese enterprise coming into the country to execute a construction or something. For example, in the first subject that I mentioned, the conditioning credits, we had, for example, some specific money for an execution. And it was executed with Chinese technicians, with Chinese labor, with materials. I mean, it's a credit that will never formally arrive to the country, that will not generate any job opportunity, does not generate economic mobility inside the country in Ecuador, because at the end of the day, everything was going to China. And what about this element that up to date, I mean, is pretty weight, and many of you have seen in the communication means the recent visit of our president to China, the pre-sale of the oils, pre-sale the oil of hundreds of barrels of oils in a fixed price for the money not to come finally to Ecuador, not to come, but in order to have some liquidity and, well, to cover some holes, fiscal holes in our budget, in the general budget of the state. So there's always been a direct relation in the specific case of Ecuador, of the Chinese capital, and the interest in mining oils, and also with direct exploitations, execution with oils, with some legalized enterprises that are working up to today. And unfortunately, the way these activities have been taken, have been developed, hasn't been due to the Ecuadorian regulation. Is something that we need to consider, because basically the contracts have been addition contracts where Ecuador has nothing to do. I mean, no opinion. And there is also an emblematic contract from the last government. The ones that were there doing the execution, they were kind of like slavery. They were kind of slaves. And there was a claim from different human rights organizations on the ombudsman, or so it was received as an answer that, well, that was a diplomatic territory not subject to the legislation in Ecuador. Like whatever that happens right there is China problems. I mean, so Ecuador has nothing to do right there. That was the response. The consequences of all these, we are suffering those consequences up to today. We are still paying the debt. We are still paying with pre-sale. The resources of oil are conditioning out to 2025, and I would like to finish right here. And we thought that it had finished, and then the pandemic played this particular role because Ecuador has got to talk again to China, in this case, the government of Guillermo Lasso, to execute the successful vaccination plan through the vaccines, not only the sale of the vaccines, and also donations for the Ecuadorian people. Mauricio, thank you very much. We will be talking about about how the pandemic with the COVID-19 speed up the corrosive capital's entrance. Okay, so but let's not do some spoiler. Eric, welcome. You can tell us your general perspective about it.
Thank you. Very interesting and very good to be here in Bogotá. So, working with my friends and colleagues here over the past day, it's very clear that what's happening in Latin America has a lot to do with corrosive capital and its effects. But I want to be careful here to say that this is not a lens by which we're anti-investment. We want investment to come into our economies. We really want investment, but we want that investment to benefit our citizens. We want the benefits to come to our companies. We want the benefits to accrue to a working class in our countries and to transfer knowledge, transfer expertise, and build a sustainable future for each of our nations. What's happening with corrosive capital is not that. It enters a country opaquely. It's not accountable to stakeholders on the ground. And it's sometimes not market-oriented. And this is where the geopolitics comes in. So the objective here of working with corrosive capital is not to stem or to stop the flow of capital coming into the country. All emerging markets around the world need that capital. It's a question of how we can best have that capital work for the most amount of people and to create a sustainable economy that spins off positive externalities to reinforce markets and to reinforce democracy. So the seeds for a lot of what we see today were sown in the 2008 financial crisis. And if you look at a map of FDI around the world, in 2008, with the worldwide financial crisis, it just went off a cliff. But the capital needs of many emerging markets and emerging democracies did not stop. They were still there. And we see many governments around the world be willing to compromise on their sovereignty, on basic market principles in order to attract capital to their markets. It's a deal with the devil. And we're reaping some of the results of that today. Now, I fear that with COVID and another pause in foreign direct investment into emerging markets, governments will be tempted again to go back and to waive environmental protections, to waive processes and procedures that have been developed over decades to protect economies, to protect citizens' rights within an economy. And this will lead to short-term gains, a little sugar rush, if you will, for the economy, but again, seed more problems down the road. The objective here, as my colleagues mentioned, is to move from corrosive capital to constructive capital. So how can we take this investment that's already coming into a market and make sure that it works for the most amount of people, make sure that it's transparent, make sure that they're participating fully in our economies, and to make sure that it's market-based, so we understand one another. Now the problem, we mentioned China a lot here, so this is not an anti-China thing. What it is an authoritarian market system which doesn't exactly play by the same rules that our systems play by. There's this intertwining of business and government that we just don't see in many other places around the world. And with the size and scope of China, it's had impacts on this world trade system, world financial system that we've created in the post-war era. Now, up until the 2008 crisis, it was kind of patched over. But with that dearth in investment in 2008, we really saw these cracks emerge. And into those cracks are these authoritarian capital was placed. So, not anti-investment. We want investment to come, but we want it to work for people. I'll stop there.
Absolutely. Muchísimas gracias, Eric. Y Catherine, si nos quieres dar
Muchas
tus
gracias,
5 minutos.
Catherine. If you want to give us 5 minutes about what are the main implications of the corrosive capitals in Latin America from your point of view.
Buenos dias. Thank you so much for including me in today's discussion. I've learned so much from my Latin America friends here. So today I'm just going to share quickly about kind of corrosive capitals implications and also observations from Asia Pacific's point of view. And the reason I wanted to do that is because I see a lot of similarities. And I think this is a platform for us to kind of compare notes. So this is not a single event or a fluke that just happened in the Latin America region. Instead, this is a consistent trend happening in my region, happening in your region. So I think this is a great platform for like bring us together and then really to talk about what can we do together, to kind of react and mitigate potential risks. So again, the infrastructure deficit is huge and tremendous in my region. So when you travel to the second tier cities in my region, like the Philippines, Burma, or, Nepal, you see that, there's a consistent reliance on wells for water, generators for electricity, and also dirt road for transportation, right? So still, that shows that there is a huge need for infrastructure investment. So apparently, and obviously the introduction and arrival of the Belt and Road Initiative from China met with open arms from the policymakers from my region in the Asia Pacific region. But then over time, people realize that sustainable development requires not just capital infusions, but requires both capital and good governance. So without good governance, certain kind of capital would exacerbate governance risk and will breed corruption, as many of my co-panelists already explained. So CIPE and our partners, adopted this term corrosive capital to describe this phenomenon, right? And then also at CIPE and then at the Asia Pacific team, we started a new project called Belt and Road Initiative Monitor, so BRI Monitor. This is basically a transparency initiative to try to encourage more information disclosure from partner countries and then try to push for greater transparency of Belt and Road Initiative projects. And we have observed 3 major trends from partners' research. The first is there's very questionable return on investment, but then it offers very clear benefits to those in power and those that are close to power. So in Malaysia, the East Coast Railway project basically served as a vehicle to launder money, cash, for then Prime Minister Najib. And, by inflating really the cost of the railway, and then the cost of railway in the end is 3 times as much as the original estimate. So this is not just happening in your country and your region, it's also happening in my region. And then the second trend that we have observed is, I think Mauricio, you already talked about, is there's very little trickle-down effect or spillover effect to local private sector or private sector. So all the money stays in the hands of Chinese companies, and they award contract directly to Chinese contractors, and they import laborers. So without creating any opportunities for local private sectors or creating opportunities for local job creation. And based on our research, we did case studies and then looking in depth of 19 projects funded by China, and all of the contractors are awarded to Chinese firms, and most of them are state-owned enterprises. 1 out of the 19 projects, the lead contractor is a private firm from China, but it has been disbarred by the World Bank since 2004. So this is like the type of profile of the contractors that involved in the Belt and Road Initiative projects. And then the third trend that we have observed is that there's really just a unnecessarily level of secrecy of on any kind of agreements that signed with China. So it creates a lot of trouble for the public to hold the government accountable, and it also make it really difficult to kind of evaluate the wisdom of these investments for the general public. So in the case of Cambodia, our partner did a research on a dam project. So originally, the project was cited at $215 million. But then later on, like the amount is more than doubled. So in the end, it cost $540 million. And this is a case that you can actually find how much the project cost. In a lot of other cases, more than half of the Chinese funded project, you cannot even find how much the project cost. And so in the case of the Philippines, our partners' research discovered that there's a very specific kind of a provision in a grant agreement they signed with China that prohibits the Philippine government from disclosing information to the public about this specific project. And there's a very specific provision that the Philippine government has to seek prior written approval from China before they disclose any information. This is very bizarre, and this is in direct violation of the Philippine Constitution, because the Philippine Constitution guarantees the rights to know that they have to make these agreements public. So that there was a lawsuit filed in the Supreme Court in the Philippines on this case. But this is not just in the case of Philippines. The secrecy is kind of ubiquitous among the BRI projects. So with all these risks, I want to go back to Eric's point. We are not anti-China. We're not anti-Chinese investment. We all recognize, I think through the comments, that we all recognize how much we need Chinese investment to support infrastructure development in all our countries, so then we can all have more inclusive and sustainable development path. I think then for us, we realize that what we need to do is we really need to work hand in hand with our own partners, with the host country's government, to encourage them to disclose more information. And that's what we're doing. We're trying to work with our partners to address governance gaps, and then we're trying to encourage more information disclosure of these projects, so then more people and the general public can benefit from these investments projects. So I will just conclude my opening remarks here, and then we can discuss more later.
Perfecto, Catherine, muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much, Catherine. You all were talking a little bit about the elements that I would like to go deeply. We, the economists, we do not work about perceptions. We work on measurements, measuring. So what you cannot measure, well, does not necessarily know how it's being perceived by the public opinion. So we need metrics. So what I would like to ask you, and you can just answer, so what is the perceptions of the corrosive capital in your countries? I mean, has it changed? Is it worse? Is it better? I mean, how can we measure it? How can we meter? Do we have any kind of poll survey? Do we have any tool for us to understand if the public understand when we talked about corrosive capital? So I don't know, what are your insights, your thoughts? Well, in Argentina, we do not have any tool to meter or to measure. There are some elliptic or indirect measurements. For example, Argentina in the Perception Corruption Index, we are in the 43% over 100. Well, in Argentina is 38. And the Perception Index have trust or accountability in the government from the main private university in Argentina, they tell us. It's close to 23%, but this trust is related with economic subjects and matters. So going back to the subject about the infrastructure investment in general and in a specific way, in the last 30 or 40 years, the corruption was associated to the public construction or to the public contracts in Argentina. That strengthened the public investment and government's money system. Well, out of that, we have the bilateral loans. We do not know the conditions. And if we do not know, then it implies a risk. There could be more corruption, or there could be an affectation to the community, to the environment. There could be a effects. So to measure that perception is pretty difficult, especially because of the lack of information. And I believe that, well, we need to have transparency, at least in the results of every single project. For example, if there is an energy project, how much energy it added to the matrix, to the energetic matrix. For example, if there is a project with environmental impact, what communities is really impacting? And I do believe that this is a central point. I'm saying let's begin from the result, from the end, because if we want to monitor the projects, we need to have a base or a regulatory base. Before the project is signed up, well, there should be some transparency conditions to have more transparency. So I believe that the best way to approach to this subject that you're asking, well, we need to see how they are working. This is part of what we're doing with the general analysis, that it has an economic component, regulatory transparency components, and this is something that we would like to wide up or expand. But I would like to start first because with the result and the outcomes of the current projects, and then we will move for the beginning of the new projects. It seems you want to say something. Well, yes, and something very punctual is not enough about perception. I mean, to say we have China like built-in, I mean, all the time in our countries. For many years, the opacity we were talking before, it's been right there. I mean, that darkness, we cannot access to the data. A couple of months ago, we were able to see the data in Ecuador, for example, in regards about the external debt, about the oil pre-sales, and to understand the impact of all that in the national economy. Nobody knows how the citizenship is going to react once they observe or absorb the information and once they see the real impact of the common citizens. I believe that the sensibilization task, this cannot be only six experts here talking about corrosive and capital. So we need to go and talk to the common citizen. We need to tell him or tell her this is the direct impact in your own economy. This is what is really impacting our country, impacting you. If we are not able to make the common citizen to understand, well, the perception would be only a cliche. But this is really real, and so we need to go deeply. We need to go straight to, well, the common citizen. Well, what I would like to compliment about Chile, well, the regulatory framework is, I mean, our foreign investors, they need to adjust it to a regulatory framework, as you say, that sometimes Chinese enterprises, they bring their Chinese workers. In Chile, it cannot happen. We are obligated to have 85% of the labor, they have to be from our country. If we talked about the perception, we have some polls or surveys that measure the perception about the international presence and specifically about non-democratic countries. Well, the perception in the years before the pandemic, that was very good, favorable, especially because China is our main commercial partner. We have the biggest amount of exports and investment to that country. But with the pandemic, that perception changed due to people say that the virus was generated right there and theories that are in the public opinion. But the perception, it's being much more sensitive. Last year, for example, we have an open contract for the passports, identity cards for the civil registration, and this was won by a Chinese company, and then it was rejected by the Chilean government. So that also generated a perception of relief in the public opinion because apparently, well, the government or the United States government has they were part of that decision. So, well, the public opinion, it's been adapting itself, and we have an active society. We've been able to create awareness, And with our research, we hope to get more real data in order to measure the impact of all these investments. Damian says something that it was interesting, and I would like Catherine to help me to talk a little bit more about this. I mean, multilateral, the Inter-American Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, they have some obligations to do impact assessment or evaluation of the projects in order to see if those investments worked or not. And I just wonder if the Belt and Road Initiative, they have any kind of tool for measuring the infrastructure impact, or they are only depending on a political objective. Bueno, muchísimas
Very
gracias por
interesting
la
question.
pregunta.
So, in our region, for the Belt and Road Initiative, a lot of it is because of the kind of a sole sourcing practice that I've talked about. It's really difficult to have a third-party evaluation. So, like pre-project planning stage, there should be like environmental independent assessment. There should be like social impact independent assessment as well. But then for the Belt and Road Initiative projects that we have done, for instance, in a case of Cambodia, basically these are supposed to be done by independent third parties, but then they end up being done by the subsidiaries of the state-owned enterprises, who is the lead contractor to implement the project. So, in terms of, the supposedly like kind of oversight mechanisms to ensure like quality implementation, so far, unfortunately to say, we have not seen this. And the BRI initiative is more like a government to government, like bilateral relationship. They do it usually sign like a MOU, grant agreement, or corporate agreement, and they started to implement project. But in a more kind of multilateral development bank initiative, also headed by China, is AIIB, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. And even for AIIB, so there was this research done by independent Chinese think tank. Even for AIIB, supposedly they should have also oversight and then greater transparency, because that's kind of the founding principles of AIIB, because they wanted to be kind of meeting the World Bank, meeting the international standard. But for the two cases, these independent study being done on China, so it's AIB funded project in China. Still, like the transparency, the independent evaluation is not met, these sort of requirement. So, but I think there's hope, because more people are paying attention to this, and so by demanding greater transparency, by requesting Chinese stakeholders to do better, I do believe that these sort of pressure will have positive results, because China is also paying attention. They want to do better.
Muchas gracias, Catherine. Eric, una de las cosas que tú estabas mencionando
Things you were
ahorita
talking before, and I would like to extend the question to the rest of the panel. I mean, what was the effect of the pandemic, COVID-19, over the corrosive capital? Not only because, well, it increased the needs for funds or financing in many governments or countries, but now we have the conflict in Ukraine, in a global fiscal position that is weak. Not only because the inflation is going up around the world, the price of the oil, it's going to affect many countries that do not produce oil. And actually, the countries, all producers, they do not produce gasoline, they do not produce naphtha, they do not produce different products, subproducts. They're going to have a very fiscal, difficult decision. So what is your perceptions about the effect of the pandemic over the needs or the necessities of the government to have more space or more investment, foreign investment? And what about, how do you think the war in Ukraine can affect this as well?
So, just until a week ago, or a week or two ago, I was the Deputy Regional Director at CIPE for Europe and Eurasia, where I ran our Ukraine programs, and I have a 20-year history in Ukraine, so I'm well positioned to comment on this. Thank you for the question. So what we see in Ukraine is something that's transformational on a global scale. So if COVID perhaps marked the end of the last decade. The war in Ukraine, Russia's aggression in Ukraine, marks the start of a new era. So we see national banks tightening policy, raising rates. We see commodity prices surging, not just commodity prices like oil or like grain, but across the board as the world tries to make this energy transition into a green energy transition. Everything is more expensive. And unfortunately, when everything becomes more expensive, those at the bottom of the pile, those that are in the least developed countries, are at the greatest risk. So what I see is a much greater need for international development and support for those countries. Now, what about those in the middle? Those in the middle, to me, are some of the most interesting cases, because this is an opportunity for those that are in the middle, not quite developed, not quite not developed. They have an opportunity, and I'm a big believer in agency. And so we cannot control the intent of the investor coming into our country, but we can control our response to it. So whether it's in Chile or in Argentina or in Ecuador, we can control how our governments respond to this investment. It is our job as citizens to make sure that this investment benefits the most people. And so this project right now, as Kathy mentioned, it's vitally important to bring this, and my colleagues from Ecuador also mentioned, to the attention of the public, right? So what's in it for me at the end of the day, right? We all live in democracies here, and we have to answer the question to the citizens is why should I care about corrosive investment? We need to make the case as economists, and I know that you don't like to get into opinion as economists, but I'm going to force you to. We need to make the case as economists is that this is vital for the long-term sustainability of both markets and democracy. And without the decorrosification of capital coming into our markets, we're going to face an increasing pressures on prices, lower quality of life for citizens, and increased political unrest, which I will end on, because the last point is that because everything is becoming more expensive, and because those at the weakest end of the development index are prone, we're going to see a much greater incidence of political unrest around the world. So we're entering a very dangerous territory.
Absolutamente. Y me gustaría saber si ustedes también están
Absolutely, and I would
dispuestos a
like to
decir
know if you are willing to say something about the pandemic or the war in Ukraine. Well, thank you very much. To talk a little bit more about what Eric mentioned, it's very interesting. Every single country around the world, we have needs, finance or fiscal needs. Argentina, at least, to talk about what I know. We are facing several challenges. Argentinian people, we feel special in particular about some phenomena. But well, I can tell you that number one, we enter into the pandemic with a crisis, with a big debt from the monetary to the monetary. I mean, we have a $45,000 million in loan that make a lot of restriction for the Argentinian government. And besides that, during the last 5 years, from 2017, 2017, 2020, 2021, the deficit was very close to 5%. So it's a very important deficit, and essentially motorized by interest and the finance, the primary deficit, incomes and outcomes of the government. It has some fluctuations. So all this is a very complex panorama due to Argentina has less resources to manage due to the financial crisis, the economical crisis, the pandemic, the inflation that in the last 50 years was very tough with Argentina, and it reduced the investments eventually in order to do. So with this, I would like to say, building about what Eric mentioned, that Argentina necessarily needs investments of any kinds. And this is what we have today. At the end of my speak, I'm going to talk a little bit more about those numbers to understand the panorama or the bigger picture. But with this, I would like to say that now it's more important to talk about transparency, to have specific requirements and a very strong regulatory framework, because in this moment of necessity, where Argentina has a geopolitical crisis, well, the pandemic, the finances for our country, and the fiscal subjects for our country, I do believe that is the moment to say, well, we need more funds And in this moment, what it matters is the amount and, of course, the quality of those incomes or inputs. I mentioned that at the very beginning. I would like to make a comment about what, taking into advantage of the context of pandemic, well, the corrosive capitals have generated this link with the Bazin subjects. Bazination, I mean, how is possible that our governments, by the way, our governments are celebrating the acquisition of vaccines from the state-owned Chinese, Russian laboratories that in our region they were geopolitically they have a division like the division of the corrosive capital per se, and they are also celebrating that soon we will have Russian and Chinese laboratories to produce those vaccines connected to the health. Now it's not necessary to build roads and infrastructure. Now let's go for those laboratories. Under what conditions? I mean, the same conditions that we are used to for all this time, for all those years. Maybe taking advantage of the Latin American necessity to produce something for the citizenship. They found a new hole to filter and to generate this dependency. I believe we need to pay attention because maybe we are all celebrating that we all have the shots and the vaccinations, but there will be a new way for corrosive the economy with resources coming from authoritarian and totalitarian regimens. Well, thank you very much. And one of the things that in several opportunities we have talked about is the importance of the press, journalism, research, the importance of having or producing intelligence and information about those matters. So I would like you to tell me a little bit about what is the state of that environment of overseas, or I mean, in Ecuador, we know that there was a president that was doing the corruption in the overseeing of the press or the communication means, and it may happen in other countries, like the restriction to the communication means. So what is the status of this in this moment for the citizenship? Thank you, Sergio. I would like to begin, as I mentioned before, on institutionality and press are very strong. But with the new constitution proposal, there are some items under the discussion, like what kind of topics could be used by the press and the communication means. So there are very sensitive topics that maybe will damage the control system that we have now that is very strong in Chile. Once again, about the pandemic, we saw a very strong impact in the institutionality. We have specific capitals coming from China. It has the investment direct record. In Chile, every year it was always Canada and United States. So we have a laboratory for productions. We celebrate it because, of course, the vaccines and the shots help us to overpass this crisis. But as you said before, well, the press and the civil society, the think tanks, those are the ones that create or cause the display of data, the research, the investigations. Journalism is really well welcomed by the civil society, and this gives us some tools to turn these corrosive capitals into constructive capitals. Well, to continue with the Sophia's line in Argentina, in the last 40 years of democracy, we have a free press. Very positive with all the political colors. Sometimes we have some issues and sometimes it gets really spicy, the debate. But I would say that the press has a very important role when seeing or overseeing all these investments that are coming from abroad, out of the public investment system, but also out of the public debt. This is something that at the end I would like to remark, where the bilateral loans, they operate like debt under the lines. Whatever that Argentina cannot control in the financial debt market, well, they try to get it from one-to-one loans that are repaid eventually with the cash flow from the construction, for example. But, well, going back to the roles they have the press. They have to role for those subjects that have no strong institutionality. Number one, as a source of information in the context of an improvisation or a mode of investment that does not have a lot of processes. The journalists sometimes they travel or they are assigned to some specific phone presentation, or when the president travels, and those journalists they bring that information for think tanks or NGOs or for academic researchers, and they are like a source. It's important to honor this and to keep this, to maintain this, but at the same time, they work as a diffusion mechanisms when we do research investigations, so we can support on the journalism and in the press for spreading out the information. So they have a very important role when complementing the analysis methodologically, academic and institutional analysis, and well, it's important to have them. The public sector regulating, implementing, the NGOs, well, not necessarily overseeing, but giving recommendation, technical recommendation to the government, and the journalism spreading out and having a narrative about the subject and making it public. And well, in that sense, I believe that journalism in the global level is in a crisis, not only for credibility, for example, what is happening in the social networks, but it's also competing for attention with many other things. I mean, in Twitter nowadays, the trending topic is the case of Johnny Depp. So the attention of the public is not only limited, but also competes about those vital subjects and strategical importance for the countries with some other topics. And I just wonder what's the best way that we, think tanks, that journalists, and we need to connect with the public in order to let them know that those topics are much more important than, for example, the divorce case of Johnny Depp. Well, I believe that we all agree in the diagnosis that the communication means and the traditional journalism, they are facing a crisis, especially when we all have the possibility to be reporters in communication means with an account in a social network. Behind that diagnosis, we need to find a solution. I believe that the responsible from the civil society is to have a different way the authoritarian government have. They believe that the government is only to block or to introduce content or to doing the restriction, the free restriction, the restriction to the free information. So our responsibility, there should be more diffusions, more free expressions through digital channel. If people see as a priority the divorce case of Johnny Depp, I mean, it's up to the citizens. I mean, it's not the means false. Maybe we are guilty because we are concerned about these subjects, and as I said before, we need to lend our discussions. We cannot just feel that we are more wisdom or more intelligent because we are speaking and or showing our academic credentials. We need to go out there and communicate. Well, of course, we need to use our Twitter and Facebook to share knowledge, not to be selfish and to keep it only for us. And to begin to construct, of course, with critics, but with proposal, with critics, but with specific actions. So, well, in our hands, we need to go to have this association, the right to the protest, to the strike, because we know that that is the focus the totalitarian governments want to attack. I don't know why. Well, during the first year of the government of Joe Biden, they started talking about Build Back Better Work as a way to reduce their map rope. And well, what I wonder is there was any expectation about these programs? I mean, in the countries where you are, or it was only one thing that was only staying in the United States and in the Congress and in a discussion right there that maybe was not well socialized. So I don't know, maybe Catherine and Eric, maybe tell us a little bit about not talking about politics of United States. So, what was your perception of this subject?
So yeah, I think that as we started at the top, noting that capital is needed in emerging markets and emerging democracies. To this point, especially after 2008 and the financial crisis, the only big actor on the scene that's growing is China. And if we are not present, we, the West, and within the West, I would include, Japan and South Korea and Australia. If those democratic markets are not engaged in Chile, in Argentina, in Colombia, and Ecuador, if they're not there, authoritarian markets will be. And so I think it's incumbent upon market democracies in the world to make sure that they're there and to make sure that they show up. The financial centers of the world, there are several. There are some in China, but the majority of them are located in liberal market democracies. Why are they located there? Because there's a deep trust. When you give your money up to buy this thing that's called a share, it's this kind of ephemeral thing, you trust that all of that governance and all those institutions will do their jobs, right? And so an indicator for me in South America, in Latin America, of development would be the additional growth of domestic financial markets. Because at the end of the day, it cannot be international foreign direct investment that is the answer and end all to the infrastructure crisis or to the infrastructure deficit. What we need to see is more local investment. And to do that, we, the financial centers of the world, need to support additional financial market development so your own businesses, your own private sector can partner and work together with some foreign direct investment, but a lot of local private capital in order to meet those needs.
So if I can, I think that's a great question. And I think that's a question that we often being asked, right? But let me just share like a kind of a personal anecdote here. So when I was traveling to Asia, one of the former minister told me and reminded me that, Kathy, the people of my country, they care more about where the next meal is than democracy. And I think that says a lot about us, who we are, what we do. So as CIPE, we care a lot about how to make democracy deliver. So we care about how do we create more opportunities, how do we improve livelihood, how can we set people up better for a path towards inclusive prosperity. And I think that's kind of where we're a little bit different is our perspectives and our work are often grounded by local perspectives, right? So it's great that the US is going to have build back better world. And it's great that Europe is going to have, global gateway. It's great that, China has this Belt and Road Initiative, right? So from the host country perspective, from partner countries perspective, is like, yes, if you want to invest, if we want to improve our infrastructure, so then we can have more growth. That's great. I think that the question and problem is, these countries, their relationship with the US, their relationship with the EU, their relationship with China, right? How do we make sure that when we are receiving these investments, we are also requiring them to meet international standards, to be transparent, to be accountable, to have good governance? So I feel like these are kind of parallel track, right? So yes, great if there will be more investment coming in to fill the infrastructure gap, but then I feel like that's the conversation and the relationship, each government and each region should have and should kind of take that upon themselves to take the initiative, to start that dialogue, to push back, to demand more for your own communities, for your own citizens. So that's kind of my perspective, and I think that's also how our partners feel about it. I do want to quickly comment on the media and also the public opinions. So I know in Colombia, the election is coming up in like less than 40 days. And then in Asia as well, we have an election coming up in the Philippines, in PNG, in Malaysia. So our partners are actually taking advantage of these kind of campaign season, right? And then to talk about why it's important to release more information, to have more information disclosure, to have greater transparency, to kind of, time it right into these sort of, campaign season that candidates are paying attention what the citizens want, what citizens are demanding. So I think, these are really just a great timing for us to highlight our research findings and then present the facts and the data. Let the data, let the evidence to speak for itself instead of us, like opine on things.
No, y ya que tocas el tema.
And well, now that you mentioned about the elections, well, Catherine, here in Colombia, we'll have an election coming in 40 days. And right now, sadly, the geopolitical topics, the subjects related with funds, they are not the center of the debate. They are not. The debate is centered about the economical model that the country should have, about the deeply feeling of inequity of what the people do not like, the current government, the delusion of the political parties. I mean, I would say that if Colombian people could have all the politicians in a cruise and take that cruise in the middle of the ocean and sink it, they will. They will. But well, it's clearly that's not going to happen. But what it's true is that the lack of a political system, the lack of a political system that debates about ideas to be transparent, to seek precisely the benefit of the citizens per se. I mean, to expand the borders of production, to expand the possibility of the consumers to acquire cheaper products, to improve the rules of the market. That would be great. But in that world, we do not live in that world. So the question that I have for you, Chile, Ecuador, and Argentina, where maybe you were safe for a couple of years to have an election, but in your countries, maybe Chile, with the Constitutional Assembly, it might be a moment to discuss this. So how do you see those impact subjects impacting the political agenda in your countries in the midterms before the elections? Because I don't know, well, in United States, there will be an election and there will be another one. So in Colombia, that is going to be the case. So in your countries. Well, in the case of Chile, we just had a presidential election and we are going for the next one, that is the constitutional election. As you mentioned, in Colombia, Chile, there is not so much debate about the subject that we are discussing right now. Foreign investment, transparency, those are not the subjects of the agenda. They are not in the headlines of the newspapers. Maybe we are guilty, the think tanks and the civil society, because we are the people in charge of positioning these subjects in the public opinion. And that's where we are working on right now. What Catherine mentioned, there are many initiatives for foreign investment, the great world potencies. We have to be ready to receive. We have to do some work from the civil society to integrate these subjects in the discussion from the Latin America to be prepared to receive those investments. And well, then we can select what investment we can assess through transparency standards. But there is a work to be done. That's the problem that I see locally in our country. Argentina had an election before the pandemic, right before the pandemic, 1 year and a half before the geopolitical crisis of Ukraine. And the presidential election is going to be in 2 years. 1 year and a half. I might say that these subjects, I mean, the way we see it in Argentina has to do more with the public management that could transcend in the election. It has to do with regulations, with continuing with the transparency pathway. In that sense, I believe that if we want to add a public value to the analysis of these subjects, is to be much more sensitive about the reasons for these investments. In the case of China, those are the bilateral loans that Argentina has now because it's the only country we can say right now why to invest in hydroelectric dams. Why now the Chinese government are going to begin the four nuclear plant. So this has a geopolitical interest of China? I don't think so. If we see the energetic matrix of Argentina in the last 5 or 6 years, we were importing between May and September when Argentina requires a landmark $8,000 million in gas from Russia, from Venezuela, from Bolivia, many places. And Argentina does not have gas pipelines sometimes. So we bring the gas with boats and ships. And if we see different aspects of the energetic matrix, Argentina depends in an 85% of hydrocarbons, and the two projects that I mentioned are dams and nuclear energy. They are renewable. They may have some environmental risks, so they are not windmills, but they are renewables, and they will try to reduce the dependency of hydrocarbons. They are, so I believe that the extra point for the public management. I mean, let's forget about the elections. It's not part of the agenda for the elections. I believe that this is something in that sense, I believe that to be more sensitive about the reasons of those investments and about the requirements, the institutionality that they have is the key point from now on. We are about to get the first year of the new government, but looking backwards and thinking about the election time, when you have a high percentage of the population with no satisfying needs, and besides they've been hit by the pandemic and by the bad management, well, the efforts that we could do from the civil society are not going to be relevant. What was concerning to the Ecuadorian person in the election process, they really want to know what was going to happen with the vaccines. After the vaccines case that we have in Argentina, we were concerned about the health and the reactivation of the society in general. They were concerned about the job generation. And when a person does not have a fixed job and how to take food to the table, they do not care if the capital is Chinese or is Russian, it comes from Thailand or from the United States. What the person wants is money to have a job offer. And in particular, the subject of the security, which is something that could be managed in this sphere. I believe I'm thinking in the future election, and probably the same is going to happen. Because not only the government plans is not included subjects sensitive like these ones, or but they do not go deeply about the potential linkage in the funds for the politics that may have corrosive capitals or the inference of foreign governments. I'm not going to mention any may have in the election, in the campaigns we've seen in Latin America, troll centers or troll centers that, and they are in a big country between Asia and, so we're gonna see the influence right there. So those kind of things we need to manage that. Again, in order to get to an election problems and to face the corrosive, the first phase is to generate now awareness in the people of what they are and why they are important and how these corrosive capitals impact their daily lives. If we do not generate that self-awareness with think tanks, we can go to the next elections to talk about the candidates, about the relation with the totalitarian regimes, and as good politicians, they will give a great speech, they will convince, and they will be selected. Catherine, I wanted to ask you something before talking country by country deeply. Well, Mauricio just mentioned Africa indirectly, and I believe that Latin America has many lessons to learn about Africa, about corrosive capital coming, and also from Asia. I mean, what? I mean, do you think those are the main lesson learned that we need to learn? Because we are in an investment cycle right now, and those regions, they already faced that 20 years ago. So, what can we expect that is going to happen with these corrosive capitals? What do we need to be prepared for, and what are the perspectives that we need to prepare for that moment?
Thank you. So I guess I will maybe talk about two big points. One is, so we're figuring out, we're trying to find a way to really, make corrosive capital more constructive. And that's why we, from my region, we started this BRI Model project, which I encourage you to check it out. So it has this transparency heat map. So we use 38 different data points to really, these are very basic data points about projects. So how much does the project cost? When does the project start? Is there independent, EIA, SIA? These sort of very basic information. The local government should proactively disclose. So these are really the bare minimum. And we're trying to use this as a tool to advocate and then to communicate with different government officials and then to really encourage them to do better. And it's in their interest to do better as well. So that's something that we're trying. So we have been working on this project for 2 years, and we just recently started this discussion with the government officials, and we will see how it goes. We're very hopeful that they will respond positively. The second thing I do want to mention in the response is things are a little bit different. And you means like we as a host country, as a recipient countries, we have more leverage to push back on China front than we think. And the reason is, first, China has a huge industrial overcapacity. So like when they wanted to, build more nuclear power plant, build more railroad, it really is not just that they want to invest in our countries. It's also they want to offload the industrial overcapacity from the China side. And the second thing is they have extra credit. They have huge foreign reserve. They don't know what to do. Like they need to look for projects that are profitable, that can generate return for them. So there are incentives from the China side. And then third is that, China is, become one of the great powers in the world. They are interested in exporting standards. So on the China side, it's like printer, right? So when you buy a printer, what costs more is not the printer itself, it's like the ink that you're going to buy because you're already bought into the standard. That's a similar kind of logic with Chinese systems like the railway, the nuclear power plant, right? So you will require Chinese technical staff to come and help maintain, train, transfer back to your country's technical staff, right? So all these like future maintenance, future change of railroad track and all the components all cost money. So like they're in for the long game. They are interested in exporting the standard. So all these is in their interest to build more projects. And also from state-owned company, from the China side, the state-owned companies' perspectives, they wanted to sell more. Like they have their own performance target they want to meet. So I do think you have a lot more leverage than you think to kind of push back to demand like greater transparency.
Eric, ¿quieres comentar?
Sure. Yeah, I think that Kathy hit on a few great points. In Africa in particular, CIPE works on a program called Ethics First. And that's where we work with SMEs to improve their ability to have compliance programs that are compatible with Western standards. So as we saw from the sanctions against Russia recently, it wasn't just state sanctions. It was private companies that made the decision that we can no longer morally or ethically conduct business in this country. So what you'll see with a lot of multinational corporations, because of the demands of their shareholders, not just stakeholders, their shareholders, to do business in an ethical and moral way. If you own shares in Nike, you don't want to support child labor. You want people to be paid a fair wage. And with civil society organizations and the internet and these great social media tools that are the curse of us all, we can have that information in minutes or hours, not weeks, months, and years. And so companies are very sensitive to that. And so the more we can do to build up the capacity of local firms that feed into multinationals, that create local value, so we have good corporate leaders here in Colombia, here in Chile, in Argentina, the more we can do to have progressive companies, companies that adhere to high standards of labor, environment, et cetera, the better off those middle countries are.
No, muchísimas gracias. Y
All
antes de
right, thank
pasar a
you
hablar
very
de
much.
Chile,
And before talking about Chile, we're going to start with Chile. So I would like you to talk about what do you think are the main institutional barriers that we have as think tanks, as journalisms, researchers, our communication means for finding that information. Is financing, is maybe a government that is extending the deadlines to give public information. Maybe those are measurements imposed by governments that maybe the constitutions of the country. I mean, let's have a list of things that I mean, if we would like to be the top researchers in this subject, what are the things that we are missing? I would like to start with the first item: opacity, bad regulations, and the lack of guarantee to the access of the public information as a human right, and precisely the the many relations are covered, generating confidentiality or where there should not be. That's the first item, not the menu. Well, I continue with the list. I might say that in our case, there is a lack of transparency in the public contracting sector. We would like to have a registry of real beneficiaries of the companies that will facilitate the work a lot. And obviously, the lack of research of this subject because, well, this kind of new. Well, I would like to be pretty short. Like my partners in Chile and Ecuador, I might say that Argentina has a different case. I will not add to the menu, and I will divide it into two sides. The first one has to do with the think tanks. So we would like to have a huge team mining data, working in the analysis, and having a very robust communication team to impact the traditional means and the social network. But that is, well, only a wish. It's a hope. It's the northbound to follow, to continue working. But, well, talking about the public sector, what difficulties we have, I would say that basically they are two. 2019, there was of the report analyzing Argentina that the regulatory environment is fragmented. It means that an agency that evaluates the Ministry of Economy does not impact the construction ministry to talk about, for example, infrastructure subjects, especially. So maybe a bigger integrality would be important because from the institutionality side, Argentina is pretty robust. That does not cover the bilateral loans. Those are the investment of China in strategic infrastructure. So I would say that is a more integral vision from the regulatory vision of Argentina that is not so fragmented. And besides that, is a scope for public contracting and for bilateral would be also important. Well, thank you very much. And from Colombia, one of the things that I would say that is missing is a philanthropy ecosystem that permits these organizations to be sustainable through the time. Because I can have an investigation that is very interesting, but if I do not have the staff for communications, if I cannot sustain the impacts of this research for the next 10 years, it's going to be pretty difficult. Colombian entrepreneurs, business persons, they are not investing in that type of researches and studies. They are investing is in paying the memberships to the different groups and or unions, and they are doing lobby in front of the government in order to extract more well money, taxes, or better regulatory agreements, not to improve the competitiveness in the country, but also to stock the country and to promote and stay where we do not have a commerce with China, not to have a commerce with the United States, not to sign up new free trades, and not necessarily to improve the environment of management, to improve the environment of the country. So, well, it would be easy to say, well, it's what we need right now is more money to continue working in this or that. What we also need is to have a critical vision about the local capitalism. They are not improving the work conditions, and instead of improving the conditions of the market, they are extracting rents and money and trying to avoid the competitiveness. And well, with this, Sophia, I want you to talk about Chile because Chile is in a process, for a very interesting process. But I'm totally sure that inside it has a complicated situation, a new constitution, and all that it implies. But also they have a brand new government that is, they have very different ideas, different to the former government, maybe more radical ideas, but is giving some ideas of the geopolitical vision when they were against the invasions of Russia in Ukraine. And I just wonder, what is your reaction to that? Are there going to be any surprises in the short term or in the midterms? And what is your opinion about the Constitutional Assembly? Well, we are in a very excited moment in that sense. The new government has promised to change the government system, expanding the fiscal expense. Well, obviously, the outcomes or the logical results in the midterms, the uncertainty will be increased and the debt will be increased. It's going to be more difficult to have funds, external funds or external investment because not everything could be done from the with the foreign. Maybe we're gonna have to negotiate, but there hasn't been any too much conversation about that subject, and also about the geopolitical orientation of the new government. They've been pretty quiet in the last weeks. It also changed disapproval pretty high. It said that they are waiting the result of the constitution that will change all the tools that the government will have for doing the government. They're saying that maybe they're going to give more power to the president to totally destroy the Senate. It will affect, we will not have so balances. All these processes are pretty slow and they take a lot of time. The constitution will be ready in July. There will be a referendum in September with mandatory voting for the citizens. And I would say that from that moment, we will really know what is going to happen in Chile, what position Chile is going to have, because so far everything is being very diplomatic and pretty quiet in that context. And well, the public that is seeing this broadcast here on internet, they are asking what are our perspective about Colombia. Well, I am honored to tell you, well, clearly we are in an environment that anti-incumbent in English is where the government has a disadvantage, or the government begins with a disadvantage, and the candidates, the selected candidates, they have a disadvantage. A candidate, it's they have only the 3% of possibilities to win when the president has an approval of 35, under 35%. So in this moment, the president Ivan Duque has an approval of 34%. Even though the polls and the surveys are showing us emerging that it's narrowing between one candidate, Federico Gutierrez, and another candidate, his name is the antagonism of the government, that his name is Gustavo Petro. Our perspective is that Petro has an advantage in the final election. Maybe there will be surprises. Well, yes, like in every single election, there might be surprises that change the perspective of the people. But how these affect the perception of the corrosive capital in Colombia? Colombia has debt of the 63%. Before the pandemic, it was close to 35%. So there was an over debt, very pronounced, from the pandemic. That the government took advantage of this for importing inputs and vaccines, but also to produce subsidies for the people to keep their lifestyle. These subsidies will expire this December, and as we know, in the case of Ecuador, the case of Peru, the case of Chile and Brazil, when the government take away the subsidies, well, there will be social strike and protests that might end changing the perspective of the government. That happened in three occasions in Colombia in the last 3 years. So it's like Ivan Duque government the right side, I mean, they were not aware that those changes were going to happen, especially with what happened in Chile and what it had happened in Brazil in previous years. So, from that standpoint, we are in a cycle now where the fiscal pressure that the government has, not only to keep the subsidies, but also to expand the fiscal expense. They will have pressures between the relation of the debt with the PIB, and Colombia has received the sovereign qualification, so we are under that qualification that makes Colombia the interest rate of those future loans are going to be astronomical. And we're going to be in a very fiscal position, very difficult. So, what would be the outcome? Well, the corrosive capital is a solution, and unfortunately, that discussion is not being given in the country. There is no discussion about that. In one of the candidates, Gustavo Petro, that is the favorite, he decided not to take any position about the invasion that Russia is doing to Ukraine at the very beginning in February. And he's not being emphatic in having any, in talking about any effort of China having relations with Colombia. Our relation between Colombia and United States, it's been very strong, it's been solid, but it's been a relation that it's been based on the fight against the narco traffic. And after 40 years fighting against the narco traffic, that does not change our society. They hasn't changed the the people's consumptions in Europe and United States. It hasn't produced any development, and we are still in a spiral of violence that affects the rural areas. So there is a big pressure for the next government in Colombia to stop that policies against narco traffic. And of course, that might change disruptions in the relation with Colombia, with the United States, that will generate an emptiness that eventually will be filled by corrosive capital. So I believe that Colombia perspective is very, very concerning, and it's something that we are seeing very carefully. Again, there is too much time for the election to occur. But what we know so far, I mean, Colombia is not the only country where this is happening. I would like to know, for example, we're going to be talking with Argentina, because in Argentina, the government has had a diplomatic approach and political approach very deep with some of these countries due to the pandemic. And I would like to know, because Argentina is a civil society that is very active in Soviet's anti-war, is very active in some other matter. So how the invasion of Russia to Ukraine has changed this perspective, or if it changed the political calculus somehow, or what are the consequences? Thank you. Argentina has a very, I mean, in the 76, with the problem with the Soviet Union, were the main buyer of. There are no many prejudices, and it's very pragmatic to have these relationships. So some of the challenges that Argentina had that motivates these type of relations that has also with United States, Europe. It's very wide along all the governments. It's an state policy. The problems of Argentina that lead to this more than 60 years of high inflations continuously. Because the currency is just changing, but every single currency absorbs a very inflation hit. More than 40 years of debt crisis since 83, where there was a big renegotiations, and in the last 20 years a financial crisis that is not the same about debt. Argentina has a very restricted access and expense to capital markets, and in the last 20 years they started signing these bilateral loans. When there is an emptiness generated, somebody will fill it up. Connected to this, I was thinking, and I said, Argentina, in the context of these problems, we have to add it the pandemic, we have to add it the consequences of the crisis with Ukraine, because Argentina is very far away of this local context. They have challenges, and their own resources are implemented in local policies, social, economic, and so on. And that is given in a scenario where, for example, between 2018 and 2019, the capital expenses of Argentina were restricted and reduced up to 100%. It was very, very strong, up to the 50% every single year in regards to the last year, to the previous year. Capital expenses with their own money. And for the same period, the external credit were reduced in the same proportion between 20 and 21. The capital expense with their own money, they recovered or they reboot this 100%, and the capital expense with external loans, they were increased in the same period 2.5 times with external funds, 2.5, 250% it means. So for this year, for 2022, the projection of those capital expense with external loan, well, 65% with multilateral organizations, the CAF, the BF, the World Bank. They have a very specific implementation, sanitation, and very specific requirements about post-assessment, but the 20% is with China, especially with the Chinese bank. So that is a very important proportion for having investments that are not attached to specific requirements that are kind of free. So the 20% is breaking to, I mean, Argentina has $14,000 million of investment in China that is distributed in trains, nuclear energy in these moments. Previously, we have hydroelectric for $10,000 million that are debts under the line. Is a way to participate in the financial market, but in infrastructure. And that is very interesting. But we also mentioned that one of the problems in Argentina are the finance in this context. The deficit that we've been having, the public resources are given to local policies and not necessarily to infrastructure, and that is complemented with external money. We can say that China makes a match of funds in $18,000 million. There is a swap agreement for international reservoirs. For Argentina, it's important to keep the value of the currency. Otherwise, we will have a stronger inflation every single year. So I would like to say these incomes of capital sometimes are for infrastructure, and they are more related with the finance parts. They have a lot of requirements, and they have fewer requirements, and they are not very clear. not only the dynamic of this income, as Catherine mentioned, the money is available. We want to invest it. We want to get loans in China, but there is a match of funds in the financial level, and that is something to be analyzed because it has to do with the macroeconomic political policies of Argentina. Also, the it's necessary to make some decisions in Argentina due to the loan that it was renegotiated. These $18,000 million of swap represent, if they are fixed, one third of these loans, and they operate like a debt under the line. So those are some of the elements that we see for the Argentinian context. Well, thank you very much. And well, let's talk about Ecuador because right there, the president Guillermo Lasso renegotiated successfully the debt in a move that was very controversial the last year, but at the same time, the overseeing of was in Ecuador. We have used the corrosive, but the free press was restricted for a long period of time in that country. So there is a lack of technical capacity in the local communities for seeing or checking those projects. So what is the perspective? Well, about the first point, I believe to clarify, the former government was finishing and the Guillermo Lasso's government was beginning in regards to debt. On December 2020, Enid Moreno travels to Washington and he meets with a development committee in the United States. And they offer to the country $3,500 million for rebuy or refinance the debt. For Ecuadorians, we only received the announcement. We don't know what happened later. Then Guillermo Lasso's government, and what you're saying is like at the end of 2021, the announcement of a trip to China to gather in the highest level to say, let's renegotiate the debt. And not only that, because I believe that more important, we can have another forum about that subject. I mean, let's talk about the data of the oil pre-sales because as a country we are being damaged because the contracts are up to $30 or $40 a barrel, and in the international market it was over $100. We are losing money, and we saw a very happy president go into the airplane to meet the president in China, and the president say in 2022 in Christmas we will let you know with the debt and with the oil pre-sales. For now, thank you for buying the vaccines, the Chinese vaccines, and go back to your country. So that shows how the corrosive Chinese capital has all the power, and it's going to be very difficult to perform something for the benefit of the Equatorians with an economy that is very complex, and only they're going to perform their own interests. So let's see what happens next. The problem of the external debt in Ecuador, I was listening to the days or the in the last year, and even though the Ecuadorian law said that the big debt should be up to 40% of the gross domestic product, we have some commitments, internal debt and external, up to 69.8% of the gross domestic product, and there is a regulation that gives a deadline of 10 years for organizing the finance, and to reach the 40%, we continue acquiring the credits, loans, and international commitments to fill the fiscal in this spiral. But well, let's go to the good part, the second point that you mentioned. Well, yes, we have a government that guarantees the free expression, the free press. There was a transition with the previous government, but I believe that now we can say that the free expression is guaranteed. We don't have a president taking away journalists or reporters. And well, maybe the president has a little problem with the newspapers, with the Pandora Papers. It was not well seen by the citizenship, but also the closed circle. There is free expression. Well, yes, there is in certain aspects, but it's very difficult to rebuild immediately that was destroyed for 10 years. It will take some time to talk about free expression, but I believe we are in a very good path. The same with the processes of civil society. The freedom and association has got to be guaranteed by the government. At the end of the day, the organizations, the critical organizations, we are not being persuaded towards, I mean, they do not like us. They're in the right, but we are doing our work. We are not scared of going to the court for due to the legislation has taken away these sanctions, but the civil society is more relaxed in regards with the last period. We need to work not only in Ecuador but also in the region in general. No matter who's in the government, we have to try to get this framework for civic spaces to be adjusted to the international standards. For our free expression not to depend of the president. For the work of the civil society does not depend on a minister. And like it or not, whatever we say or do, we could be relaxed to do it, not to be persuaded by that. So we have a big challenge right there, but I believe that many countries in Latin America, they are in the right pathway. And well, with this, we will conclude the panel. I would like to give you 1 minute, only 1 minute, for telling us what are you taking from here, what subject, what matters, I mean, what needs to be solved. All right, so Catherine, 1 minute, please. Bueno, muchas gracias de nuevo. Ha sido un placer para
I've
mí estar
learned a lot
aquí. He
today
aprendido
from
muchísimo.
my co-panelist and Guzman. So one thing I do want to mention is just how important transparency is. So through our project, and then because we have been trying to look into examining Chinese investment, the economic footprint from China throughout Southeast Asia for the past 4 years. And really from 4 years ago until now, still the biggest challenge for us is not enough information. And there are also times that our researchers, the partners, trying to go to visit the project sites, and then they applied and then they got denied. So really, just to make the information more available is in everyone's interest. And so we really encourage, the stakeholders on the ground, the stakeholders from the China side, all go back to really the bottom line, what Martial said, the international best practices. So once we can achieve that, I think we are closer to inclusive economic growth. Thank you.
Okay, so a couple of quick takeaways. Looking at all of the problems around the world, and the world's on fire, it seems. Comparatively, Latin America comes out looking rather good for all the problems, for all the issues, for the backsliding. You still have the rights of association, which is key for labor, for business, for civil society organizations. As long as you have the right to associate and act collectively, governments are limited in what they can do and how far they can push. You have the free press as your spokesperson or your loudspeaker to advocate for that. Elections come and they go. A new government comes in, a new government goes out. So I hope here that civil society organizations in Latin America continue to build political capital with political actors, regardless of what side of the political spectrum they're on. Because whoever's in power will be in power for the next period, and you do have a tradition of elections. And you have to work with whoever is in power.
Hay una frase,
There is a sentence that I always use it for some years, and it's not recently, 2,500 years ago. Platon said that the price of not understanding the government and to be governed by the worst man, and not only is applied for the discussion of the corrosive capital, transparency, access to the information, but it's also applied to all what happens in the sphere of the public. I mean, if we do not have a citizenship active concern about what is happening in the public space, not only doing representative democracy every time they vote, every 4 years, but being engaged and involved in the authorities' management, if we do not have citizens willing to push and to participate, not only criticizing from the Twitter account, we will be in this spiral with no way out. And we can do brilliant work with the civil organization, the think tanks, because we need the citizens. And I believe that here we are, organizations, national, international organizations, and we really want to keep into account the opinion of the citizens. We want to open the space for their ideas, for their proposals, for their complaints to be taken to the decision makers, but mainly we need them. Let's not leave everything in the hands of the authorities and the politicians because we know the results. We need to start out and do it by ourselves. Thank you. Very, very motivational. Thank you. Well, this panel was interesting. Personally, I have learned a lot. We have many, many common cases, but the solutions are very similar. We need to have a more transparency to raise the standards. We need to adapt to grow. As many countries that are an example for us is strengthening the democracy, obviously, and the same as Mauricio said, we need to encourage the public opinion, spread what we are doing, and thus our labor as foundations or think tanks, and with the support of CIPE, we can definitely do a great job for a common problem with common solutions. Thank you, Sergio, Catherine, and Eric, Mauricio, and Sofia. Well, it was really great. What I'm taking from these panels, and besides giving a lot of information of Argentina for you to be able to understand about the southbound of the world, well, I believe that we have a lot of compliments to take from here. I mean, everyone here have a strong and a weak point from their analysis from their countries. It could be that Argentina, an Ecuadorian case, is the case of the free press. In Asia, reported about the South American case about transparency. The regulatory case can report to other countries. Everyone was able to give something, and in my level, I have a lot of mental notes. Maybe I will see the recording of this discussion eventually. But I believe that I have all these complements or this mutual information. How can we report mutually in order to have a strong and firm position to be strong in a moment when Ecuador 40%, Colombia 60%, Argentina 100% of the debt. So it's the moment where we need more resources and we need to manage those resources much better. Well, thank you very much to all our speakers. We are really thankful for the knowledge that you have shared so far. Thank you very much to CIPE, Center for International Private Enterprises, for promoting these spaces to connect. We really want to thank all the people that were in the streaming connected, all the people in person here for 1 hour and 45 minutes of this meeting, and we invite you to follow us in the social networks, to all organizations, to the Center for International Private Enterprise, to the Fundación para la Libertad, Foundation for the Progress, and CIPE. Well, thank you very much, and see you next time.